It's rough, man. Everybody needs a rough friend, but only when they're not mad at you. All right, U.S. history. It's about some rough friends, isn't it? We'll get started here. Um, so, I was going to look at due dates. So let me remind you of some due dates. See if I can do that without closing the entire internet or breaking things. The optional assignment, book review Friday, optional assignment Monday, and last question next Friday. And the quiz, crud. I was just thinking I made the quiz live on my 1302 class for one student, and I may have put too many questions in it, so I'll have to go back and look at that. But book review Friday, optional assignment Monday. Is that you? Optional assignment? Yeah. And then next Friday, last weekly question, which we'll talk about a little bit today. We'll talk about more next week. We'll wrap stuff up next week, whatever. It's confusing or still needs to be. And maybe review a little bit for the quiz together, because you know what else are we going to do? We're going to do something, right? Okay, so weekly question. Was Reconstruction a success or failure? Something in between. In your response, consider land policy, key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction. That would be the military version, 5 military districts and that sort of thing. Racial and political violence, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. That's really the second Grant administration. And, ow, sorry. I really, really think that you should end with the compromise or bargain of 1877. Goodness. I bet I've had a gallon of water today. It is not helping my throat at all. And ow. So in this answer, things I really think just have to be there. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment has to be mentioned because that's pretty key legislation. We don't add amendments very often. When you discuss them in parentheses, at the very least, put what they did. So 13 freed the slaves, 14 gave citizenship and equal protection to former slaves, 15th allowed former slaves to vote. At least do that, okay? I would also mention toward the end, the presidential election of 76 and compromise of 77. We'll talk about that today. And then in the middle, you have all these choices. Land policy, that's where you could talk about General Sherman's order, or you can talk about Johnson reversing that order, and any legislation that gave land from plantation owners to former slaves. Key legislation, that's probably where you want to bring up the amendments, but you can also talk about the Force Act or Enforcement Act that requires or allows states to ask the federal government for assistance from the U.S. Army to protect Black voters from the KKK, oh my goodness, Southern politics, racial and political violence. That gives you another chance to discuss the KKK. Northern fatigue, that's probably where you talk about during the Grant administration, the federal government being less likely to assist Southern states when they ask for help during elections, and then wrap it up with election of 1876 and compromise / bargain of 1877. We'll talk about those things in a few minutes, but I think you got a whole lot of specific stuff you can talk about in here. I don't want you to write 3 pages, so don't go crazy, but make sure you talk about specific stuff, okay? And at some point in there, talk about whether you think Reconstruction was a success or failure or something in between. You know that typically when you get a question like this, the answer is something in between. So you're probably leaning more toward one end than the other. I'm nervous about somebody who's got behind you with a bag. Don't let them put the bag over your head. It's dangerous stuff. Okay. So define success and failure. Your optional assignment, pretty open. Talk about something that I didn't ask you about that you think is important. I think this will be easier if you pick an event or a person. That's what I would do. So a law, a battle, a war, a president, not president person that was important. I think that'd be easier because it's more defined. I wouldn't pick a big thing like racism or foreign policy because those things are huge, okay? So I'd pick a smaller thing and be really specific about it. It does have to be an important thing, but if you can prove to me that it was important, like maybe to you, I don't know, maybe the most important thing to you was some writer that we didn't even talk about, or maybe it was some advancement in medical care. There's not very many of those during this time period, but they noticed that you should clean stuff, medical instruments before you use them. That's fairly important, but there really aren't very many medical advancements. But you could talk about the impact of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence on other people's revolutions, but that's pretty big as well. I would pick something small. That's what I would do. So you do that, and that'll probably work better. But you do whatever you like. You know how this works. And if you have questions about that, let me know. But I'm going to tell you up front that I'm probably not going to be caught up on grading till about Tuesday. So yeah, sorry, busy week and weekend and due deadline for my other job. So sorry. Plus I'm sick. What the heck? All right. Why does that happen when you don't need it to happen? All right, let's look at the notes. You know it always does. It's like your printer breaking. It's all the same, right? All right, let's look at the notes. What the heck? Where were we? All right, we were somewhere around here. I think maybe we had started to talk about impeachment, maybe. Andrew Johnson, he's a little cranky. He liked to yell at Congress and swear at them. He's sort of like your band director or your football coach. All right, or your history professor, or Mr. Sloan. That man's out of control. I'm just saying. But all right, I was trying to think who else would run around and scream. Miss Raby, that woman's scary. She's not scary. Everybody's nice at Cedar Park High School. Andrew Johnson, however, not so much. If he disagreed with you, you knew about it, he yelled at you, that sort of thing. He's a fairly assertive guy. And he, of course, got into arguments with Congress and congressmen, vetoed a lot of their legislation, and this seemed frustrating to Congress. So they decided it would be good to impeach him. So unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, you have to find something illegal that the Congress has done for you to impeach the president, or excuse me, let me try again. Something illegal the president has done for you to impeach him. Now, if you can't find anything illegal, perhaps you could pass a law, and that's what Congress does during this time period. So they passed a law because they knew he was about to fire the final cabinet member from Abraham Lincoln, a fellow named Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, and honestly kind of gave Lincoln a bad time too. But he really disagreed with Johnson. He didn't disagree with Lincoln about too many things, tactics and that sort of thing, but certainly not the overall ideas of what Lincoln wanted to do. But yeah, he really disagreed with Johnson. So Johnson said it's time for him to go. So Congress passes a law essentially that says you can't fire Edwin Stanton without our approval. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. And what it specifically says is you cannot fire an appointed official who's confirmed by the Senate without the Senate's consent. Now, likely this is unconstitutional. So Johnson wasn't terribly worried about it. He vetoed it. Congress overrode the veto. He fired Stanton, and then Congress goes, that's it, you're impeached, buddy. Now, impeachment, as you know, we haven't done very many times. Although in your lifetime, we went a little nutty. We did it once with Clinton and then twice with Trump for good measure, because once wasn't enough. Throughout our history, they started it with Nixon, but Nixon said, I'm out before they finished it. and Johnson. So Johnson's the first, and then Nixon, although they don't finish. So Nixon's not technically impeached because they don't finish the process. He resigns. Then Clinton, they do finish the process. And Trump, two impeachments for Trump because Trump's special. And none of these times do we convict the president. So there you go. Although, well, that's not exactly true. It is exactly true. Never mind. It's like they didn't convict. Clearly, Clinton was guilty. It's just what they impeached him for was probably not worthy of kicking him out of office. So they just went, you know what? Let's leave this one alone. Okay. Johnson's guilty of violating the Tenure of Office Act, but since they wrote the law specifically to get him to break a law, some people felt like it was unfair. So some of the Republican senators decided to vote against the conviction. And some of them did it because Johnson's lawyers met with Senate Republicans and said, look, it's his last year. He's going to try to calm down. He's not going to do anything else crazy. Maybe you could just let this one go. And then others voted against it because they thought, you know what, we really did set him up, and this is much more political than it is legal. And of course, the intent of impeachment is to get a rogue dude out of office. You know, if he's breaking the law, if he's doing something harmful to people, then you don't want him there. And it was used successfully with some judges, but it hasn't been used. It does tend to calm people down, though, a little. Not Trump, but, you know. And Johnson sort of, you know, he was at the end anyway. All right. And it did force, Nixon resigned because of it, because he knew he got convicted and didn't want to be the first one. Well, anyway, Johnson survives impeachment, but then finishes out his year, doesn't run for re-election, and instead we get Ulysses S. Grant for 2 terms. Now, I did notice in my notes I really don't talk very much in my notes about the Grant presidency, so we'll talk more about that next week. You know, a little of that's going to be on the quiz, plus it's kind of important, so we should probably talk about it. Johnson, some stuff that Johnson does during his presidency. So I'm trying really hard not to sneeze. Johnson orders the federal government, it's really loud when I sneeze. Andrew Johnson orders the federal government to return any confiscated land to the former plantation owners. Now, referring to it as confiscated land will give you an idea of where Johnson stands on this, but this was the land that was taken away from plantation owners and given to former slaves. You saw this with the field orders from William Tecumseh Sherman. And you saw it in a few other places as well. So the land is taken from the former slaves, given back to the plantation owners. And then you end up with an agricultural work system where poor people who don't own land work for wealthier people who do own land. And that's the main thing that happens in the South for jobs. So there's 2 parts of this. You've got crop lien system and sharecropping system. Most people participate in the sharecropping system. This sounds like a retirement plan or something cool like that. It is nothing cool at all. But crop lien system is where you are kind of poor, but you own some land. And your land is not very good. It's cheap land. It doesn't grow stuff very well, and you don't have very much of it. But you're still trying to farm it, but you're pretty broke. You probably don't have enough money to farm your land well. So you may have to borrow some money to afford the equipment or the seed that you need to plant your crops. So, or fertilizer, or whatever the heck else you need, cow poop, or, you know, whatever you use. I don't know. Do you think people buy cow poop? I don't know. But they can't afford everything they need, so they have to borrow. Now for collateral, you guys familiar with collateral? Like if you have to get a loan, the bank will want some sort of collateral. So if you don't make your payment, they get something out of the deal. Now, if you're buying, most people get loans from the bank to buy a house or to buy a car, because most of us can't pay cash for either of those things. Unless it's a Kia Soul, and then maybe you can pay cash for it. I'm just saying, that's what I have. But the way the bank does it, like I had to borrow money to buy my house because I didn't have $8 zillion. But if I stop making my house payment, guess what the bank gets? My house. And then they'll sell it and they'll get their money back. So my house is really collateral for my home loan. That's kind of the way that works. And then there are other loans, like I could borrow against the value of my house to, I don't know, whatever I would do with money. So I get a home equity loan, but then if I didn't pay that back, they would also get my house. So collateral is something valuable this bank can sell to get their money back, or that whoever gave you the loan can sell. So when the crop lien, if you were the poor farmer in the crop lien system, you borrowed against the value of your land. And then if your crop failed and you couldn't pay back the loan, then the bank got your land. So now you're going to move over to the sharecropping system because now you're a broke dude without land. Most people in the South were broke dudes without land, whether they were black dudes or white dudes. Most people in the South were really poor, broke dudes without land. And because it's an agricultural economy in the South, that makes you in a really bad spot because it's not like you're going to move to a city and maybe start a business because there were like 10 cities in the entire South. So you probably weren't going to them to start a business. So now you're in this sharecropping system, which means you're going to farm somebody else's land. And then when the crop comes in, they'll pay you a percentage of what they get from the crop. But you're probably really broke. And if you're a former slave, you're way beyond really broke. So this is an even harder system for former slaves because former slaves don't have a house. They don't have a place to live. And they don't technically own anything because, you know, as a slave, they never got paid. So they really, if they owned anything, it was probably the clothes they were wearing. So the place they lived, they didn't own. The tools they used, they didn't own. So when they became free, they're also incredibly broke. And to get a job, the only thing they'd probably done was something around the plantation. So the plantation owner says like, hey, you're free now, that's cool. And they go like, yeah, that's cool, I need a job. And the plantation owner goes like, well, we got to hire people, so why not you? He said, but I noticed you don't own your own house. So if you want to keep living here, you're going to have to pay me rent on the slave quarter, the former slave quarters. And the guy would go like, yeah, I'll do that, but I don't have any money because you know, when I was a slave, you didn't pay me. And he said, you know, what we could do is take that out of your pay. So they deducted pay, rent, use, like loaning the tools, that kind of stuff, clothing, food, all that stuff. They would deduct from the future payment and of course charge interest. So by the time the crop came in and it was time to share the crop, probably the sharecropper owed the landowner more money than he was going to make. So it put them in a cycle of perpetual debt, that's a very bad cycle. You don't want to be in the cycle of perpetual debt because you don't get out of that cycle. Plus, they're going to pass some laws that say if you owe your current employer money, you can't leave your job. And that sounds a whole lot like slavery. Yeah. It's slightly better for white sharecroppers because they probably have a place to live that isn't tied to their job. It's only slightly better, but it's slightly better. So this is a system that perpetuates the wealth and power of the former plantation owners, but now they're just the rich landowners instead of plantation. And getting out of the sharecropping system, it's like getting out of cyclical or generational poverty. It's a hard thing to do. It just is. So, because you don't have any resources as a foundation, it's tricky stuff. You know, we used to talk about poverty a lot when I taught certain classes at Cedar Park High School. And I think you guys have noticed probably, you ever drive down 183? You ever been down 183? There's a stopping point where, you know, the guys at the street corner come over and ask you for some money and maybe they live under the bridge. You notice about where that stops. It's about the Williamson County line. And, you know, there's different laws and I think there's different perspectives of poverty, you know, in different parts of the country. So I know we used to talk about that a lot. Where I grew up, everybody was poor. We just assumed you were going to be poor. That was the way the world worked. When I taught at Cedar Park High School, everyone assumed they'd be a millionaire someday. And it's like, that's a weird assumption, but people did assume that. I don't know, but most of us are somewhere in between. But if you start off in that extreme poverty like sharecroppers did, it's really hard to get out of that. All right. So this little paragraph explains all the stuff that I just talked about much more succinctly. Yeah. Sorry for the yawn. All right. 15th Amendment. I know I mentioned to you, you should talk about those amendments. 13, end slavery. 14, equal protection under the law and citizenship for former slaves, reverses Dred Scott. And 15 allows former slaves to vote. Women's groups argued that the 15th Amendment should also allow them to vote. And so some women attempted to vote and got arrested. Can you imagine? What are you in for? Voting. It's not a very exciting story, is it? People probably aren't terribly intimidated either. But the women's group, American Equal Rights Association, will split over the 15th Amendment. The National Women's Suffrage Association will oppose the 15th Amendment unless it includes women. The American Women's Suffrage Association favored it and said we can just add another one later. The national group would say some cool racist stuff like, why would you let uneducated Black men vote before you'd let educated white women vote? I'm cleaning that up quite a bit, as you might imagine. These two groups didn't see eye to eye on this, and it's going to cause probably a little bit of a delay, maybe, possibly, in women getting the right to vote because they didn't work together very well. They'll come back together in the National American Woman Suffrage Association in 1890, and then you'll see them push and eventually get the 19th Amendment. Although you won't see that during this class, will you? No, that's a 1302 thing. But you already know that women got to vote. You heard, right? We might even have one as vice president. It's hard to say. All right. Oh goodness, in my 1302 class, somebody argued, started kind of arguing in the chat today that Donald Trump did not legitimately get elected in 2016. It's like, oh, wow, I know. 1302, that class makes me nervous because we talk more about politics there and I just go like, hey, let's go back to the subject. I don't want to get fired too much. Yeah. All right, but these politics, yeah, easy to talk about because nobody's arguing like, you know, we never should have had that 19th Amendment. We're all good with this stuff now. All right, if you're wondering, were there any successes of Reconstruction? Sure there were, of course there were. Was it completely successful? Clearly not, because, you know, KKK, civil rights movement, all this kind, you know. But here's some things that happened that might be worth mentioning when you do the successes of Black congressmen elected during Reconstruction. So you had African Americans in Congress, both at the state and federal level. Probably the most famous African American senators, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. 14 other African Americans sent to the Congress in DC, the National Congress. If you ever tour the Texas Capitol, if you look at some of the really old pictures, you'll notice there's some African Americans serving after the Civil War during Reconstruction. Most southern states had African American legislators, occasionally about 50% of their legislature, if the state population reflected that. So South Carolina, Virginia, you'll see a couple of states where there are numerous African American legislators. So about 600 Black men during Reconstruction served in their state legislatures as well. You also notice the beginning of historically Black colleges. The Freedmen's Bureau is going to ensure basic literacy skills for African Americans. So you see some progress. You do, absolutely, for sure. And you're going to see some successful African American men, families, businesses make a lot of money, gain some stature. You see Frederick Douglass continue as a congressional advisor, eventually as the ambassador to Haiti. So you'll see some successes, you will. However, when Reconstruction ends, and as you see rights taken away from African Americans, you'll see that the promise of Reconstruction really isn't fulfilled. And a lot of that has to do, my opinion, which you don't have to agree with, but I'm probably right. A lot of that has to do with African Americans not being able to really substantially own property. Because I think one of the things you've probably already noticed in your short lives is that life is easier for people who have money than it is for people who do not have money. Have you noticed that? I mean, that's probably the understatement of the day, isn't it? So if you're not even allowed to own property in the South, you are never going to have money. And if you start off without any money, I mean, being free is cool, but free with absolutely no property is tricky. So you're really kind of set up to not do well. There was a lot of discussion of giving former slaves like 40 acres and a mule, something that they could start off with to maybe earn some money, have a chance in an agricultural society, and Johnson gets rid of that idea very quickly. So this is where, if you hear people talk about reparations, where people should be repaid for slavery, this is the ideal place for that to happen. And this is where this was discussed in meaningful ways and then taken away. And this is where it makes sense, because you've just freed the slaves. They've worked their entire lives, as have all of their ancestors in the United States, for no money. So there's no way they could have earned property to, make the next generation have an easier life. So this is when that idea of reparations really needed to happen, to give African Americans a better chance for economic equality, and you don't see it happening. I am not saying that that means therefore African Americans will never have a chance at economic equality. I'm saying this is the logical place for that to happen. That's why this was discussed then. And then politically, people just got tired of it. They said, we just don't want to spend our time and our effort on this. And a lot of it's because the people who really believed in it were no longer involved in government. And the people who remained, it wasn't their main interest. And we've talked before about how most people in the North really did not think blacks and whites were equal. They just wanted to punish the South. And they did not mind African Americans having a measure of equality in the South, because they were more likely to vote for things that people in the North wanted. So you've got politics kind of mixed in with all of this, which has got to be shocking to you, that even during the Civil War and Reconstruction, sometimes politics was more important than, making permanent change, that sort of. I think what else I wanted to tell you before I talk about carpet. Oh, I know what it was. Literacy test, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause and black codes and that sort of stuff. So what you start to see in Southern local politics is the development of black codes, which were very similar, often the exact same thing as slave codes. And these are restrictions on the movement of African Americans within certain towns. It would say, like, you couldn't go through certain towns without permission from a white man or without an escort or that sort of thing. So different rules for blacks and whites. There would also be requirements, if you were African American, that you had to have a labor contract that lasted for a year, and you couldn't break it even if your employer didn't treat you properly or to the terms of the contract. And if you didn't have the labor contract, they would arrest you, or if you broke the labor contract, they would arrest you as a vagrant. And then either through the 13th Amendment, you could be punished for vagrancy by essentially having to work for someone for free. That sounds a lot like slavery. Or they could just force you to go back and work for the person that you just broke the labor contract with. So different rules, they call those Jim Crow laws as well, when there are different rules for African Americans than there are for whites. And also they're going to set up different pay scales, lots of inequalities during that time period. If you wanted to vote, southern states in particular would set up something called a literacy test, which sounds great on the surface. We want to make sure you can read and write if you're going to vote, but it was not a standardized test. So the voting registrar could change the test depending on who was taking it. So if you were an African-American person, I would probably be to explain a certain part of your state constitution. If you were a white guy, it would probably be sign your name on this line. So very different tests for different people, and it enabled the voting registrars and the local governments to keep certain people from voting, voter repression. Also, they were required, voters were required to pay a poll tax, P-O-L-L. So every time you went to vote, you had to pay a tax. And if you didn't, it was retroactive to the time when you were first supposed to start paying it. But here's a catch with the grandfather clause. If your grandfather could vote before the Civil War, then you didn't have to pay the tax. So yeah, only people voting before the Civil War were white guys. So white guys were exempted from both the poll tax and by practice, the literacy test. I know some of you are thinking, well, I know there are a lot of mixed race slaves. There were lots of slave owners raped their female slaves. But when they recorded people as father, or when they reported parentage for slaves, they only recorded the mothers. They didn't record the fathers. And certainly there were, well, I don't want to say there were no slave owners who claimed their slave children. There were not very many. It was very rare. And even if they did, it didn't mean that they got to inherit property. I'm really thinking Thomas Jefferson. I don't know that I can go beyond Thomas Jefferson on that one. So lots and lots of inequalities, even during Reconstruction. And the book talks about some instances where some of these cases end up going to the Supreme Court. Excuse me, and the Supreme Court typically will uphold the inequalities. They'll say that it's okay. Sorry, the Supreme Court will say that it's okay. All right, a few other things. Sorry. Carpetbaggers, scalawags, and redeemers, nicknames for different groups of folks in the South during this time period. Carpetbaggers are folks from the North who come during Reconstruction when there's a lot of federal money being kind of spread around, and that federal money helps your business. Of course, you know, you're getting paid to rebuild the South, but sometimes federal contracts, you can kind of pump those up a little, make a little more money. So the thought was, if a Northerner came to the South with a government contract, that their main aim is, their main aim is not helping the South, but it's profit. So they call these guys carpetbaggers because, their luggage is made, everybody's luggage during this time period is made out of carpet. So, you know, it's a thicker fabric, so it protects whatever's inside. So if you're carrying a carpet bag, we know that you're not from here. So this is kind of that general sentiment that you may hear local Texans when they complain about people from California moving to Texas. No offense, if you're one of those people, you're not alone, as you know. So lots of people moving into Texas recently. But when people kind of look down on outsiders, that's kind of the sentiment that you have here. All right. I think my voice is about done, but hopefully we can get through these few things. Scalawags are the folks from the South who also saw economic opportunity by helping with Reconstruction, and they were kind of looked down on by other Southerners because they felt like they should have rejected the government contracts and rejected the opportunities that were presented to them through the military government that had taken over the South. So the Scalawags are Southerners who cooperated with Northern reformers and officials during the period of Reconstruction, and they tend to be looked down on by traditional Southern whites. And Redeemers, they were the folks that wanted to restore Southern tradition the way that it was before the war. And they are pro-business Democrats, so they're usually involved in government, and they want to get control of the government again so they can make the South again. So we can make the South great again or something like that. So they want to get control from the freedmen, former slaves, carpetbaggers, and scalawags. And they often paired with political groups called white citizen councils or their counterpart, the KKK. To be on the white citizens councils, you typically had to be a KKK member. So White Citizens Council is the political arm of the KKK. And the group was and the KKK, which we didn't talk about much, I always assume that you have a vague familiarity with the KKK. Not that any of you, belong or anything, but it's such an unusual, homegrown, essentially terrorist group that my assumption is you've all heard about them and seen them. They're the white robe guys, and initially they formed a variety of reasons, of course, but they wanted to restore the South, but they also wanted to repress any rights that African Americans had and were very willing to harm them in that process. So they would say that the main thing they wanted to do was stop Black men from voting during that time period. And there'll be lots of revisionist history about the KKK. I mean, to the point where in some states they have monuments to some of the founders, that sort of stuff. I know when I drove through, I think it's Tennessee, that they have a national or a state park named after the founder of the KKK. And I drove past there. I know I told one of my relatives, I really felt like I needed to stop and talk to them about this and say, like, are you sure this is what you wanted to do? And then I thought, well, maybe that wouldn't be the best call on my part for a variety of reasons. Not suggesting that folks from Tennessee are anything other than lovely, but maybe it's time. maybe we don't need that state park. However, we got our own stuff in Texas, don't we? I know at the Capitol there's a Confederate heroes statue, something like that. So I don't know. We have a few of those things, and I know also this is interesting. Kind of current event sort of topic. What do you do about things like that? I know the University of Texas is kind of struggling with that a little bit too. I know some of their Confederate monument type things on campus, they've relocated. And I suspect lots of Southern states will do a lot of relocating because you're less likely to have people in the South either willing to or able to destroy the monuments. Because in the South, I don't know if you saw what happened to the Alamo when all the riots were going on, but that thing was a fortress once again. So they did the same thing to the state capitol. I only know this because I had a nephew who came to visit during that time period. He's a little bit younger than you guys. And he said, I want to go see the Capitol and I want to see the Alamo. And I went, yeah. So we saw them from a distance. All right. So Redeemers want the South to be the way it was again. The KKK, certainly part of that group. The Enforcement Acts passed by the federal government to restrict the activities of the KKK and protect Black voters. So if a Southern governor asked for assistance during an election and said, like, hey, the Black men are not safe voting, so we want the army here, then the army would be sent there. And you see this used successfully in the first Grant administration. By the time you're in the second Grant administration, what you essentially see is the Grant administration saying, we don't have the money for that, you guys are on your own. So in the first term, more effective. The second term, which is 69, first term, Grant's elected in 68, so first term is 69 to 73, and then the elections in 72. So then the second term is 73 to 77. Okay. So there you go. Election in even years, they take office in odd. All right. And we'll probably talk more about the Compromise of 1877 next time as well. And we definitely will talk a little bit about the Grant administration next time, I promise. Promise. Okay. So you have Grant administration number one, which kind of carries out Reconstruction. But Grant is ill. He's got some bad advisors who are fairly corrupt. His concern really becomes more about his health and taking care of his family financially, because he had been in the military and didn't make a lot of money there. And as president, you didn't make a lot of money during this time period and spent a lot of your own. So his thought was, I'm about to die and my family is going to be destitute. So he's busy trying to write his memoirs before he dies. So maybe they'll have some money. The second term, plus we're starting to enter what we'll think of as the Gilded Age, where you start to see the businesses expand and there's a lot of money floating around, a lot of bribes. And this becomes a really corrupt era in US politics. So politicians are going to be much less interested in how we take care of the former slaves and much more interested in how do we help the businessmen. So got to help the businessmen because the economy's changing, the world's changing. We'd like to change with it, plus maybe make a little money in the process of the change. So, and we'll talk about some of the scandals next time. But after Grant's second term, a fellow named Rutherford B. Hayes, who's a Republican, runs, and a guy named Samuel Tilden, who's a Democrat, runs. The election's incredibly close, and there aren't nearly as many African Americans voting in the southern states. You see many more votes for Democrats during this time period in the South. And traditionally, this era, white Southerners vote for Democrats all through our history until about the 1980s. And African Americans are going to vote for Republicans because it's the party of Lincoln. Now that'll change after, well, at the beginning of the Great Depression. That changes in the FDR administration. But not as many Black voters in the South, more white voters in the South, less protection for Black voters, really, really close popular vote. So the voting comes down to about 3 states, and both the Democrats and Republicans help with the recount. And then what happens is the voting count is disputed. When you have a disputed election, it's supposed to go to the House of Representatives, which it does. The House, the Congress would be the old Congress, which is more Republican. People in the South thought that was unfair, so they formed a commission. The commission ends up being 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and shockingly enough, they voted 8-7 that Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, would be president. People in the South threatened to secede again. There's all sorts of turmoil. And they said, you know what, let's just make a deal. So they did. And the deal is the Compromise or Bargain of 1877. So in this bargain, the South gets 1 cabinet member. I think it was the Postmaster General. They get a railroad from Texas to California. The North gets, or Republicans, get the presidency, but the South gets the end of military reconstruction. So there's 5 military districts that were governed by military governors that were appointed by the North, and those states couldn't reconstruct their own governments, hold their own elections without federal oversight until they agreed to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, which this many Southern states did. Now all the rules are gone and they can just do whatever they want. Now they have to do this in exchange with a promise to uphold civil rights for African Americans in the South. And of course, everyone believes that that's going to happen in the South. So this is a sign to you that the North is really done with anything that looks like enforcing civil rights in the South. And if you were ever under the illusion that the North really wanted everyone to be equal, probably not so much. They wanted everyone in the South to be equal because they knew blacks would vote for Republicans, which was more helpful to the North. So here we have the end of Reconstruction, which had a lot of promise, but not a lot of success. I do realize I have some old essay questions on here, which probably aren't terribly helpful. And I guess when, for whatever reason, we decided to talk about the Dred Scott case, but your question is that one, which we'll talk about more next week. Okay. Oh my goodness, I'm tired of talking. Not because of you, it's because of my throat hurts. I enjoy telling you about history. I know you thoroughly enjoy listening to me talk about history. Of course you do. All right. I'm gonna see if do you have any questions before I stop the recording? Anything you want to ask? And we'll talk a bunch more about whatever next week. Weekly question, whatever else you want to talk about. Not Trump, not Biden. No. Not Black Lives Matter. Not. No. Okay. All right. And maybe. We're talking about that in 1302. That's fun. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.